students, and welcome to the lecture on Theories and Policies of Global Trade. After this lecture, we will be able to learn the following objectives. Understand global trade. Explain the mercantilism theory of global trade. Define theory of absolute advantage. Describe the classical theory of global trade. Discuss Ricardo's theory of comparative advantage. Explain the Heckscher-Ohlin trade model. Understand Porter's diamond of national advantage. Explain the evaluation of Heckscher-Ohlin theory of global trade. Let's start with introduction of theories and policies of global trade. Nations export and import goods and then examine barriers to trade in various steps that have been taken to lower barriers to trade. While foreign trade is not as emotionally loaded as, say, taxes and government spending, like most topics in economics, it stirs the blood of certain people. Those whose livelihoods and lifestyles are most affected by exports and imports. These people have very real concerns, but those concerns are specific to their individual lives. Economists almost universally believe that foreign trade in a free global marketplace will create the greatest good for the greatest number of people. It provides an introduction to the core of global trade theory and policy. Attention is paid to the use and relevance of various economic models in explaining global trade and evaluating global trade policy. Let us now discuss global trade. Global trades between countries and across continents have existed for centuries, including previous civilizations. Traditionally, global trade consisted of traded goods like textile, food items, spices, precious metals, precious stones, and objects of art and various items across borders. Everybody has heard of the Silk Route, as well as the Amber Road, and other famous routes that existed, and the ports and settlements that flourished due to the trade, which was carried on through land routes as well as sea routes. One has come a long way since the earlier times, and global trade today has taken on new dimensions. Companies and organizations today are no longer entities with a local identity. Multinational organizations have emerged through the previous century with footprints all over the globe. They have in fact shrunk the earth and changed the way businesses are conducted. Companies no longer limit themselves to local markets. They no longer depend upon local resources. The mercantilists proposed theory of mercantilism. They were a group of economists who preceded Adam Smith. The foundations of economic thought between 1500 and 1800 were based on mercantilism. Mercantilists believed that the world had a finite store of wealth. Therefore, when one country got more, other countries had less. Mercantilists restricted imports and encouraged or subsidized exports as a conscious policy to make their citizens better off. Mercantilists judge the success of trade by the size of the trade balance.
Trade is the engine of the global economy. More people, more goods, and more services are crossing borders today than ever before. But trade has changed dramatically in the 21st century. Through much of history, a good produced in a country was largely made of parts sourced there. Today, products are composed of parts from all over the world. To fully understand trade, we have to measure the value added at each point in the process. Imagine China exports a $100 smartphone to the United States. China may have only produced $10 or $20 of the total value of that phone. The rest of it was imported from elsewhere. Graphic design from a California studio, computer code from programmers in France, a silicon chip from a factory in Singapore, precious metals mined in Bolivia. Many countries benefit from the export of this phone, but standard trade data does not reflect this. What's needed is a system for tracing the value that is added by all countries involved in producing this phone. The OECD WTO Trade and Value Added Initiative aims to help people understand that traditional trade data is not actually telling the whole story. Standard data shows that China has high surpluses with the United States and the European Union, and a large deficit with Japan. Looked at in value-added terms, China's surpluses and deficits decrease as Chinese exports have a high foreign content. Japan is another country that has run high trade surpluses with the United States and more recently with China. Value-added data reveals smaller surpluses with China and larger surpluses with the United States. This analysis can illustrate who actually benefits from trade, and by how much, in terms of both income and jobs. Trade improves competitiveness. Cheaper imports of parts and cheaper access to services bring benefits to consumers and companies alike. To realize the full potential, we need seamless border crossings, simpler customs procedures, sophisticated logistics, and more trade liberalization.
Evaluation of mercantilism theory. Mercantilist writers have been lauded and criticized in the literature on foreign trade at least since Hume's Political Discourses in 1752. Mercantilists have been criticized for everything from their views regarding the gains from trade to their self-promotion of the merchant's role in society as being important. Theory of neo-mercantilists in mercantilism is still in vogue. Mercantilist policies are politically attractive to some firms and their workers, as mercantilism benefits certain members of society. Modern supporters of these policies are known as neo-mercantilists or protectionists. Now we will study the theory of absolute advantage. The real wealth of the country consists of goods and services available to its citizens. If any country can produce a particular commodity more and more cheaply than other countries, it has an absolute advantage. Some countries can produce goods more efficiently than others. Resource countries spill over into profitable industries, as the country cannot compete in unprofitable sectors. Natural advantages, climate, area acquired advantages, production technology, for example, the ability to produce various products. A country is said to have an absolute advantage over another country in the production of a good or service if it can produce that good or service using fewer real resources. Equivalently, using the same inputs, the country can produce more output. The concept of absolute advantage can also be applied to other economic entities, such as regions, cities, or firms, but one will focus attention on countries, specifically in relation to their production decisions and international trade flows. Complications and limitations. There are several caveats in the above analysis, some of which are absence of absolute advantage. The example discusses a situation where one country has an absolute advantage in the production of one good and the other country in the production of another good. Absolute advantage, income, and wages. Despite the limitations and complications discussed, absolute advantages, as reflected by differences in technology, are important for explaining current global trade flows and differences between countries in terms of income levels and wage rates. Daniel Treffler systematically analyzes these issues by combining the Hexer-Olin model with technology differences, while taking into considerations the empirically observed home country bias, a consumer preference for domestically produced goods over otherwise identical imports. Let's now understand the classical theory of global trade. The classical theory of comparative advantage, also called comparative cost theory, is regarded as the classical theory of global trade. According to the classical theory of global trade, every country will produce their commodities for the production of which it is most suited in terms of its natural endowments, climate quality of soil, means of transport, capital, etc. Types of cost difference in production. Economists speak about two types of cost difference in production. They are absolute cost difference, comparative difference in cost. Absolute cost differences. Adam Smith, in his book Wealth of Nations, argued that global trade is advantageous for all the participating countries only if they enjoy absolute differences in the cost of production of the commodity which they specialize. As in the case of individuals, where each specializes in the production of that commodity in which he has an absolute superiority in terms of cost, so also each country specializes in production of goods based on absolute advantage. Comparative difference in cost. David Ricardo agreed that absolute difference in cost gives a clear reason for trade to take place. He, however, goes further to argue that even though the country has absolute advantage in the production of both commodities, it is beneficial for that country to specialize in the production of that commodity, in which it has a greater comparative advantage. Did you know in 1817, David Ricardo, an English political economist, contributed theory of comparative advantage in his book Principles of Political Economy and Taxation? David Ricardo started a theory that, other things being equal, a country tends to specialize in and exports those commodities in the production of which it has maximum comparative cost advantage or minimum comparative disadvantage. Similarly, the country's imports will be of goods having relatively less comparative cost advantage or greater disadvantage. Ricardo's assumptions. Ricardo explains his theory with the help of the following assumptions. There are two countries and two commodities. There is a perfect competition both in commodity and factor market. Cost of production is expressed in terms of labor. For example, value of a commodity is measured in terms of labor hours per days required to produce it. Commodities are also exchanged on the basis of labor content of each good. Labor is the only factor of production other than natural resources. The Heckscher-Ohlin model was first conceived by two Swedish economists, Eli Heckscher and Bertil Ohlin. Rudimentary concepts were further developed and added later by Paul Samuelson and Ronald Jones, among others. There are four major components of the HO model. Factor price equalization theorem, Stolper-Samuelson theorem, Rybczynski theorem, and Heckscher-Ohlin trade theorem. Due to the difficulty of predicting the goods trade pattern in a world of many goods, instead of the Heckscher-Ohlin theorem, it is the Heckscher-Ohlin-Vanek theorem that predicts the factor content of trade received attention in recent years. Classical theories of global trade propose that comparative advantage resides in the factor endowments that a country may be fortunate enough to inherit. Factor endowments include land, natural resources, labor, and the size of the local population. Michael E. Porter argued that a nation can create new advanced factor endowments such as skilled labor, a strong technology, and knowledge base, government support, and culture. Porter used a diamond-shaped diagram as the basis of a framework to illustrate the determinants of national advantage. This diamond represents the national playing field that countries establish for their industries. Porter's diamond of national advantage chart. The individual points on the diamond and the diamond as a whole affect four ingredients that lead to a national comparative advantage. These ingredients are the ability of resources and skills, the information that firms use to decide which opportunities to pursue with those resources and skills, the goals of individuals and companies, the pressure on companies to innovate and invest, factor conditions. A country creates its own important factors, such as skilled resources and technological base. The stock of factors at a given time is less important than the extent that they are upgraded and deployed. A significant difference between the classical and the modern approach is that the former consisted primarily of propositions about the relative prices of goods. The latter offers a series of propositions about the relative prices of factors. It also appears that the classical theory was an attempt at establishing the welfare propositions of trade theory. It stressed that territorial specialization based on comparative advantage leads to an increase in the welfare of the world as a whole. In the Ricardian model, comparative cost differences are viewed under the assumption that identical absolute combinations of the factors devoted to the production of a single good would produce different amounts of that good in different countries, and therefore the relative domestic costs of production of different goods tend to vary among nations, leading to a comparative advantage in some goods over others. In other words, the Ricardian theory assumed that the comparative cost differences existed because the production function for a given good varied from one country to another, and the extent of variation differed in respect of the two goods. On the other hand, the Ohlinian theory assumes that the production function of a given commodity is identical from country to country, but it varies from commodity to commodity. For example, some goods are labor-intensive, while some are capital-intensive. According to Ohlin's theory, this factor-intensive difference in the production functions of two goods, in conjunction with explicit difference in relative factor endowments of the countries, accounts for global differences in comparative costs of production. In this way, the modern theory of global trade represents a genuine break with and considerable improvement upon the classical dogma of comparative costs. Although many countries have steadily opened up its economy, its tariffs continue to be high when compared with other countries, and its investment norms are still restrictive. This leads some to see many countries as rapidly globalizing, while others still see it as highly protectionist. Till the early 1990s, many countries were a closed economy. Average tariffs exceeded 200%. Quantitative restrictions on imports were extensive, and there were stringent restrictions on foreign investment. The countries began to cautiously reform in the 1990s, liberalizing only under conditions of extreme necessity. Since that time, trade reforms have produced remarkable results. Countries' trade to GDP ratio has increased from 15 to 355 of GDP between 1990 and 2005, and the economy is now among the fastest growing in the world. Average non-agricultural tariffs have fallen below 15%. Quantitative restrictions on imports have been eliminated, and foreign investment norms have been relaxed for a number of sectors. Many countries, however, retain their right to protect when the need arises. Agricultural tariffs average between 30 to 40%. Anti-dumping measures have been liberally used to protect trade, and the country is among the few in the world that continue to ban foreign investment in retail trade. Although this policy has been somewhat relaxed recently, it remains considerably restrictive. Regional and bilateral trade agreements. Many countries have recently signed trade agreements with its neighbors and are seeking new ones with the East Asian countries and the United States. Its regional and bilateral trade agreements, or variants of them, are at different stages of development. India-Sri Lanka Free Trade Agreement. Trade agreements with Bangladesh, Bhutan, Sri Lanka, Maldives, China, and South Korea. World Bank involvement. As a number of research institutions in the country provide the government with good, just-in-time, and low-cost analytical advice on trade-related issues, the World Bank has focused on providing analysis on specialized subjects at the government's request. In the last 3 years, the bank has been working with the Ministry of Commerce in a participatory manner to help the country develop an informed strategy for domestic reform and global negotiations. Given the sensitivity of trade policy and negotiation issues, the bank's role has been confined to providing better information and analysis than was previously available to any country's policymakers. Now in the end, let us summarize what we have learned in this lecture. Global trades between countries and across continents have existed for centuries, including previous civilizations. Technology in terms of communication, as well as software technology, has changed the way business organizations manage activities, be it manufacturing, procurement, finance, or sales. Managing global trade has multidimensional aspects which need to be considered by each country. In reality, goods are produced using several factors of production simultaneously, such as capital, land, and various types of labor. Classical theories of global trade propose that comparative advantage resides in the factor endowments that a country may be fortunate enough to inherit.